very warm welcome from Copenhagen to this fifth webinar that we're having on basically the coalition patterns after Brexit. We've been looking upon a number of countries, for instance, Spain, but also Poland. And today we'll be looking upon Ireland. And it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Professor Brigid Laffan. I think all of us at the moment sort of are thinking about where would you travel to if you had sort of the possibility. And some of us would love to go to Italy. So I can tell you that now you're able to take a mental journey, at least, where you don't even have to go to the airport, but now we will all go to Florence, because that's where we have Professor Brigid Laffan. You are the director of the Schuman-centret for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute in Florence. So good morning to you, Brigid.
Good morning, a pleasure.
Pleasure to have you with us. And this series is organized by Tænketanken Europa and is co-sponsored by the Danish Europa-nævnet, and we're also cooperating with the European Council on Foreign Relations. And basically, I also have to remind all of you that we are recording this session. You can all participate by using the chat as we go along or at the end of the conversation. I'll simply just try to make sure that your various questions then are sort of used in whenever it is appropriate, so to speak, when it fits into our overall conversation. But this is more a conversation than it's a lecture. So Brigid, first of all, because you have been following all the ups and downs, the roller coaster of the Brexit negotiations. And obviously this plays such a big role for Ireland, for all of us. But could you just give us your sort of evaluation of where are we with the actual negotiations at the moment?
I think the chances of a deal are now hanging by a thread, literally hanging by a thread. Why do I say that? I think that there are still big differences, particularly on governance, level playing field and fish. And there's time. The clock is the enemy now. And I would say we're in probably the political space will narrow after about 10 days. Now, what is difficult to determine and judge is what impact the Biden win will have on London. But I think that we would need to see substantial progress this week. But then there's also in the background what we know as the Internal Market Bill, which is a bill that initiated by a UK government, and in presenting that to the House of Commons, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland said it would break international law in specific and limited ways. There is no way that the EU can sign and ratify a deal with the United Kingdom as long as it fails to implement the withdrawal agreement, which it ratified, went to the country on, etc., etc. So I have always thought there will be a deal. I have always thought that it is clearly in the interests of both sides to have a deal. I have always thought that it would be extremely politically reckless for a British Prime Minister to go into January, February, March with no deal, because the United Kingdom is not self-sufficient in food. And there was quite a run on their supermarkets at the beginning of the COVID lockdown. And it would not be a pretty picture if you have the south of England gridlocked with lorries and the supermarkets with not full, the shelves of supermarkets. But it is also clear that within 10 Downing Street, there is a group of people who want what they call a clean Brexit. And for them, a clean Brexit is no deal. So I think what we don't know yet is what call, and the call lies with Johnson, what call he will make in the next critical period.
Which is then basically this week, that will be your point.
This week, and I would say maybe you get into next week, but you don't have to the end of this month.
Yeah. And the Biden factor, could you just explain that to us? How could that play out? I mean, with the new, with the president-elect?
So I would say two things, that under Trump, the EU was faced with an American president who had a deep, deep antipathy to the EU. He did not like the EU. He saw the EU as a competitor. It didn't suit his America First narrative. And also because he owns a number of hotels in Europe, in Scotland and on the west of Ireland, a lot of his antipathy began, believe it or not, with the Habitats Directive, when he couldn't do what he wanted to his own properties. And interestingly, one of the issues was building a wall. So Trump does not like the EU. Biden is a multilateralist at heart. He chaired the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's an old hand. He believes in NATO. He believes in a Western alliance. He believes in good relations with the EU. So Biden will privilege the reprioritization or resetting of transatlantic relations. It would not be good for the UK to exit without a deal, chaos in Europe, and then reset the so-called special relationship that the UK wants with Washington. The second and absolutely crucial issue is the border in Ireland. Joe Biden not only is linked to his Irish heritage, but he's culturally completely seeped in that heritage. He was brought up in it. It has remained with him all his life. He quotes Irish poets more often than any of us. Mm-hmm. So he is culturally very Irish, but also the United States really sees the Good Friday Agreement as a Clinton administration win, a democratic win. And on the Hill, the Friends of Ireland group has 54 members. And they have all said to him, and it's across the House, it's not just the Democrats, they have all said to Johnson, do not impair the Good Friday Agreement, specifically linking that to the Internal Markets Bill. Now, interestingly, when 10 Downing Street yesterday gave a readout of the conversation with Biden, they failed to mention that he raised the Good Friday Agreement with them. Mm-hmm. But the Biden administration came out and said that it was part of the conversation. So I think that this, again, it's a judgment call that that Johnson, number 10, and the British Foreign Office have to make. How big a difference does Biden make? In my view, an important difference from a European point of view, and it would be wise of London to think this through and to take on the hard Brexiteers.
So that would be your hunch, I mean, basically this morning, that this could push sort of the Johnson government towards a deal, but it could maybe be a very narrow deal. Is that also sort of one of the scenarios?
Any deal now is thin.
Yeah.
Thin. This is a hard Brexit. This is a hard Brexit.
Yeah.
But it's been a hard Brexit from October 16, and particularly from the Lancaster House speech, January 17. Oh. Once the UK said, we're out of the single market, we're out of the customs union, and we're out of the jurisdiction of the court, that served to narrow the landing zone of any potential agreement. But in my view, an agreement is much more important, is really significant because it can be built on.
Yeah,
agreements
exactly.
are always dynamic.
Yeah. So it'd be a very thin agreement, but then you can build on it sort of, so you would have
over time.
Yeah.
But if the British opt for no deal and engage in a blame game, then I think there will be a very serious rupture between the United Kingdom and its neighbours.
Mm. And when the president-elect, when he phoned a number of countries, well, he phoned one country that is close to your heart. So let's hear that story before we move on to the coalition parties. Yeah.
So he phoned Berlin, London, and Paris, and Dublin.
And obviously, due to his sort of heritage, but also because he looks upon Brexit as a very important topic, I presume.
He looks upon, I mean, I think he interestingly, and this tells you how culturally Irish he is, he spoke to the Irish Prime Minister about a Gaelic football match that happened on Sunday, and he knew the result. So, I mean, this is someone who's seeped in this world. He's not distant, but it would be wrong of me to say that the call was simply because of that heritage. It's also because the Americans take the Good Friday Agreement really seriously.
Well, it's always good. I mean, so to everybody listening in, if you ever happen to meet the president when he enters the White House, do remember the Gaelic football. That could be a nice sort of icebreaker at the beginning of a possible conversation. Okay, but let's move back then to Brexit when the referendum happened. I mean, and to the reactions in Dublin. Just take us back to that morning when you woke up and when also the Irish government woke up. What was what was the feeling? What was it, a shock? What was the actual sentiment? Also because you, together also with Denmark, joined the European communities at that time. At the same time back in the 70s, we've had close relations in many ways. So what was the reaction at that time?
So the Irish were worried about Brexit from Bloomberg's speech in 13 onwards. They were, or 11. Was it 11?
Yeah, I think it was 11 actually.
It was 11. Sure. Anyway, they were very worried, and they really began to be seized of Brexit when Cameron won his majority in May 15. And very quickly in the Prime Minister's office, a Brexit task force was set up, and the role of that task force was twofold. One was to interrogate and examine all vulnerabilities Ireland had vis-a-vis Brexit. Every sector of the economy, and of course, Northern Ireland. Secondly, the Irish government and embassy in London were active in the referendum with the Irish communities in the UK, basically trying to get them to vote Remain. But one of the things that started to happen was that the government in Dublin began to get intelligence from the embassy in London that older British people of Irish origin were tending leave. And this rang alarm bells. So there was no surprise. The Irish hoped for the best, but they weren't at all surprised. And the Irish Prime Minister Kenny tried several times to warn Cameron that they were handling the referendum badly, that the project feared that they had to make also a positive case for the UK to stay in the EU. So there was shock, yes, but not surprise. But there was also an understanding that the world had changed. On the morning of the 24th of June, there was an understanding that one of Ireland's geopolitical anchors was gone, because there was and is no good Brexit for the island of Ireland. It is damaging, no matter all you can do is mitigate the excess and the damage, but there's no good Brexit. But then the government decided it would be very proactive. It had a contingency plan which it published on the 24th of June, and it immediately set up stakeholder forums, all Ireland discussions on this. So there was a very active engagement with the society, and the whole tenor was Ireland can cope with this, Ireland will survive this, make Ireland Brexit ready. But also then linked to this was the need to ensure that Ireland's partners in the EU understood how serious Brexit was on the question of the land border. Why? Because from the beginning, there was an incompatibility with the British preferences. Because Theresa May said, no customs union, no single market, but miraculously, no border on the island of Ireland. And it was the incompatibility of the preferences really worried the Irish, because they knew this could not be the case. So between June 15 or 16 and the notification in March 17, Irish politicians and officials held 400 meetings with partners at governmental level, senior official level, mid-career. They flooded Europe with something called the Good Friday Agreement. And
400,
400. And they wanted to ensure that this became a European issue and to ensure that it was addressed as part of the divorce. Because, and this was, why did Ireland want it? Because you could make a reasonable argument to say, well, because it was a border, it should be part of the future relations negotiation. But no other country in the EU has had negotiations with the United Kingdom on complex issues with the intensity that Ireland has had over the last 40 years. So the Irish know London. They know how the British work. They know, they had a word for papers that the British during the Good Friday negotiations, or right through the Anglo-Irish negotiations, that the British have a tendency to deliver what they call angel papers. Now, what are angel papers? Angel papers are an attempt to get you to agree to something that perhaps you shouldn't agree to, and then to come back with this in an expanded form. In other words, they try to disaggregate and get you to break one of your core principles, but then once you've done that, then it widens the terrain. So the Irish were very worried about they were concerned that Northern Ireland would be used as a bargaining chip for the future relationship. And they wanted to make sure that the British commitment, all they wanted was that the British commitment to no land border on the island of Ireland, that the British would deliver. And as we know, it's been one of the most difficult, intractable issues in these negotiations, and will continue to be, because there is no good outcome. Either a border on the Irish Sea or the land border both carry enormous dangers and problems, but the sea border carries fewer problems than the land border.
So basically, there was a very sort of strategic sort of attempt to make sure that the Irish sort of problem would actually not be a problem for Ireland, but be a common European sort of enterprise. And there you say there was a clear sort of strategy with 400 meetings. So that must have been sort of a very, very sort of big sort of mobilization of the Irish government at the time.
It was a mobilization of all of the embassies. It was a mobilization of the permanent representation in Brussels. It was constant contact with Tusk and Juncker and Barnier to never let it slip. But also it spoke to the EU's narrative of itself, peace, etc., etc. So, I mean, you don't get 26 countries to back you on something unless the case is compelling. They're not going to back you if the case doesn't stack up. So clearly, the Irish diplomatic system and political system managed to convey to the others that this was existential. And it is.
Yeah. But that's interesting because the sort of starting point of this series has been the Coalition Explorer by the European Council on Foreign Relations. But one can see that Ireland and Denmark are not sort of countries that are looked upon as countries that are sort of very high up on the list when you ask experts. We should always sort of underline that that's what the Coalition Explorer does. I mean, basically ask experts, how do you look upon a specific country? But that's a bit difficult to understand that if you were not that well connected, how on earth were you then able sort of to push this very important dossier? So what's actually your sort of comment with regards to the Coalition Explorer before we then get to the actual sort of coalition patterns after
So
Brexit?
I think what with the Coalition Explorer, it's important not to over-interpret the data. What does it tell us? When I look at it and I see the bubbles, it tells me what I already know. It tells me who the core are. But
Germany, yeah.
I know I know the core at the EU. I don't need to see a bubble.
But maybe Netherlands was a bit surprising, or wasn't it?
No. The Dutch have
Okay.
always been very active.
Okay.
And remember that the Dutch are a swing country between France and Germany.
Yeah.
So I think there's an explanation for that. It doesn't surprise me that you don't see Ireland as being the number 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 country in contact. Why? Because we're geographically isolated. We're not a continental country. We're not we're not a Nordic. We're not Visegrad. We're not Benelux. So Ireland has never had a natural home. And although it shared a lot of preferences with the UK, it didn't share everything. And of course, the UK was also a bigger country. So Ireland would never have privileged the relationship with London above the relationship with, for example, Berlin or Paris. So the Irish strategy would be, you maintain good links with Berlin. The view of Berlin is that Germany has always been more inclusive of small states than France. But the French matter, so you maintain reasonably good links with the French, but you do understand when it comes to France that they tend to think of the big states as les pays sérieux, and the small countries are clearly not quite so serious states. So I think that matters. And then on an issue by issue basis, it would look for coalitions on particular topics. But say a new piece of legislation is coming. What the Irish would always do is look and see, can we live with this? So they then would identify, because Ireland has been broadly in favour of most EU legislation. Then it looks at the proposals to say, what are the issues for us in this? In other words, it looks at where are the potential friends on Irish concerns, who else is concerned, and work with them. And the other thing the Irish would do, and I think the British do it a lot as well, is that you don't elevate an issue if you can handle it by drafting. So if you can tweak the draft, then you don't expend diplomatic energy. So you work on what you can't live with.
Yeah. So you don't sort of create a huge drama if you can sort of tweak the text, so to speak. Yeah.
And I mean, one Irish diplomat said to me one time, Brigid, we have very few guns, not many bullets, and we use them very well and very wisely. So the Irish would tend to concentrate diplomatic energy on the things that really matter.
Such as then, at the moment, if you look upon the agenda of the EU.
So I would say, tax has always been a very tricky issue for the Irish, because we've a very low rate of corporate tax. And more importantly, there were some egregious tax practices, one of them the double Irish, that could not be defended. And so what the Irish have always wanted to avoid is any breach on unanimity on tax. Now, why the emphasis on that? US multinationals are a huge part of the Irish story. All of the big techs have European headquarters in Ireland. A lot of pharma and a lot of medical instruments, medical devices. So American tech and American multinationals in general is a very important part of Ireland's political economy. And the Irish, I was surprised when with the crisis, the Eurozone crisis, when Ireland really was on its knees, that we didn't increase corporate tax. In my view, we should have, but my preferences apparently are not shared by the government, nor are they shared by the Irish people. And if you remember the Apple case, So the vote in the Parliament supporting the government in appealing the Apple judgment was overwhelming, but equally when in public opinion. So it's regarded as one of those neuralgic points of, it's a sovereignty line. It also comes from the fact that the EU itself has a very asymmetrical economics governance model with weak fiscal capacity. And therefore, the Irish view is fine if there was a big EU budget that was a buffer for bad times. But since there isn't, we've got to have some instruments available, particularly as we're a Eurozone country. So tax is always one that they watch. And the Irish preference has always been that tax is dealt with through the OECD. But they are fully aware.
Which is a very fast track.
They're fully aware of what's coming. And I think also that's something that the Biden presidency will bring on the table. Exactly. So I have watched what they've cleaned up. They've cleaned up the most egregious, the double Irish, etc., etc. But I have no doubt that finance and the revenue understand that there will be shifts in this field. And it's a question then from an Irish perspective of managing them. But we shouldn't underestimate the importance of the presence of American multinationals in the political economy, both as employers, but also in terms of the multinationals were very important in modernizing the Irish economy and introducing an entrepreneurial American can-do. And Ireland is not one of the EU countries that has a strong anti-American base. There are those on the left, anti-NATO, etc., but it's really small.
So the digital areas where you'll be using your gun, so to speak, to use the metaphor you use, are there other issues?
I think on digital, I mean, the Irish also want the EU to move into the modernization policies. I mean, are very keen on the digital. I think Ireland is way behind Denmark on climate, and in order to reach the targets is going to have to be much more proactive in terms of right across on the climate agenda. I don't expect it to be defensive on climate. The Green Party is now a member of the government. I expect the Irish to want to use EU policy to drive the climate agenda domestically. But in terms of renewables and in terms of all of that, Ireland is behind Denmark.
So that will be an area where you could see sort of closer cooperation. We'll get back to Ireland and Denmark and the relationship there. But before that, how do you see the coalition patterns changing in the EU, if at all, now with Britain leaving the European Union? Do you see it being more sort of issue-based or more sort of formal coalitions being formed? Or what is your evaluations? Obviously, a very short period, one will have to say.
So I think the first thing to say is the UK wasn't a Euro member, and as such was not part of a whole important area of EU governance that is driving change and will drive change. On the other hand, the UK was very influential on trade, services, a more liberal labour markets, etc., etc. Of course, for all the countries in the north of the EU, they have lost a partner. I think Denmark has, the Netherlands, Belgium, Ireland, Sweden. So it is a loss, the presence of the UK at the table. And I think one of the responses has been a far more active Netherlands. And the Netherlands trying to draw in more countries into the Hansa League. And so now that has been mostly on economic governance issues, but one could see that expanding across the new EU agenda.
And how do you define the new EU agenda?
Well, I think so apart from, say, COVID, leaving aside COVID and the recovery, which is essential because
it's a bit difficult at the moment to leave that aside. Yeah.
I think the von der Leyen political priorities are the right ones: climate, digital, and Europe's place in the world.
Yeah.
And I think everything will be driven by those three big ticket items. And within each one, there's a whole host of policies. I mean, it's a field rather than a policy. So I think I think those three big ticket items will mold Europe over the next decade.
And for Ireland, I mean, what does it actually mean for Ireland's sort of patterns of coalition now that Britain has left? Do you see sort of a strategy there? I mean, we spoke about sort of what happened during the Brexit negotiations at the beginning, but do you see, just as in the Netherlands, I mean, a sort of a strategy of stepping up sort of the engagement, of having more sort of visits across Europe via plane or now via Teams, or what's the take there?
So I think the first thing to say is that the Irish will work Europe, but won't neglect the world.
Yeah.
It sees Europe also as a stepping stone. And one of the decisions of the last government was it was a global Ireland long before we heard about global Britain, to double Ireland's diplomatic imprint across the world by 2025. And that's happening. So the Irish understand that Brexit has happened. Therefore, Ireland has to be proactive on everything. The UN Security Council, the bid for a UN Security Council seat, which Ireland won with Norway against Canada, again was proactive. Ireland will be on the Security Council for the next 2 years. So it's really to try to up Ireland's game at every level, within the EU, but also globally.
And do they see sort of money being set aside for that? Is there sort of a bigger budget for the?
Of course.
Of course, you say, because that's not the case here in Denmark. So
no. I mean, I
sorry.
I think because we're also historically a country of emigration, the Irish know the world.
Yeah.
So they understand that so Ireland's tiny. So all Ireland needs is a small slice of global good and it will be reasonably prosperous. So it will work whatever levels are required, both within the EU and beyond, to achieve that. Again, Africa, peacekeeping, all the things that characterize the foreign policy of Ireland. I mean, it has had the longest uninterrupted history of peacekeeping of any country in the world. So it will use whatever it has to have as big an imprint as it possibly can. Knowing, I mean, there's no, the Irish don't suffer from delusion about size. They understand we're a small country, but they will try to use the levers that they have as effectively as they can.
Okay, so still the infamous punching above your weight and so forth.
Well, even punching at your weight is fine.
Yeah. Okay.
You don't always have to be world beating. You just have to be good enough.
Yeah. But then, I mean, sort of the strategy then to have even more focus upon the global level, that is then linked to Brexit.
I think it is. But I wouldn't say more focus on the global to the detriment of the European.
Sure. Yeah.
It's part of the same. It's part of the same thing. I also think, and this is an interesting distinction, say, between in the recent past between Ireland and Denmark, and that's on the recovery fund.
Yeah.
So Ireland was one of the 9 countries that signed the letter with Macron on the corona bonds.
So this was in, help us here, this was in April, something like that, right? I mean, so this was at least before, it was before the Franco-German Proposal.
It was what moved the Germans.
Exactly. So the Franco-German Proposal was on the 18th of May. Yeah, so this was before.
And that, for me, was a marker. So I explain it by 3 things. 1, Pascal Donohoe wanted to be president of the Eurogroup, although he hadn't declared it at that stage. 2, the prime minister at the time was a medic, and he understood how serious coronavirus was. And 3, the Irish were trying to create some space, political space for themselves in the EU, to not be seen only as a new Hansestat. The Irish did not want to be part of the frugal 4 or 5. This was a deliberate decision.
And was a debate about that in Ireland? So that was a sort of discussion that took place. Should we side with the frugal?
Not
publicly?
Not a particularly public debate, but there certainly was.
I can see some people laughing here on the line. Yeah, okay.
There certainly was a debate in government. I imagine, but I'm not privy to the interdepartmental coordination groups. I'd say there was a hell of a discussion on signing the Corona bond letter.
Yeah.
But it really was about creating political space for Ireland. In other words, we're a northern state. We've a lot in common with all the countries in the north, but we're not only. And that again goes back to, I think, an important difference between Denmark and Ireland. Denmark joined the EU as a successful, prosperous state. Ireland joined the EU as a poor state. It was a net beneficiary from the EU budget. It was unfortunately and entirely due to poor domestic policies, it was a programme country. So Ireland knows what it's like to be at the wrong end of economic divergence in the EU, and it did not want to be on the side of the frugals in this debate. Also, Ireland has become a net contributor to the EU budget, and will be in the next cycle an even bigger contributor. But that's being framed. The narrative in Ireland about the budget is, this is wonderful, this is success. This is a sign that we have converged. So the politicians are being very careful to ensure that you don't get Euroscepticism rising on the back of budgetary contributions. So the Irish are being told, this is good. We were the beneficiaries for a long time. Now it's our turn. And it's a sign that we're a successful small EU member state.
So it's your turn in a sense that now you should make sure that others will then also be able to get through this crisis.
Yeah.
So more or less of the Angela Merkel sort of a way of arguing here.
Yeah, without quite the budgetary resources of the Federal Republic.
Yeah, right. Yeah, okay. And without sort of Second World War and so forth as being sort of a Germany's contribution. But I mean, the very fact that Europe can only get through this crisis together was part of your narrative. Whereas in Denmark, it was very much about sort of our contribution to the budget, and if the budget should increase, then one should cut the budget in other areas and so forth. So that was very much of the Danish debate about that. But there you had a debate that was more similar, you could say, to the German one then.
And I think it's also important to say that there was a realization that if the EU successfully recovers from COVID, it's good for everyone.
Yeah, which is kind of like the German way of arguing, could say. So the budget negotiations on the recovery fund is a clear example of how Ireland decided to have a flexible sort of system of coalition building. I mean, you did not want to side with one group as such, the Frugal Four, but actually use that opportunity to create the space, as you argued, by then signing up with a broader group.
And also because the Irish clearly are very attentive to Berlin, as all countries are, it also, I think, was sending a signal that on this it was on Macron's side, that Macron's demand for European solidarity, given COVID, given the nature of the crisis, was right. I mean, it was a conviction decision. It wasn't just instrumental.
Yeah, not just a tactical sort of decision that if we do this, we can gain something in the future. No, okay.
I know the Irish finance ministry well, and they wouldn't likely make that decision. Yeah. So I imagine it was, it really was a reflection on what was felt necessary for the EU at this stage.
And the Hanseatic League then, seen from an Irish perspective, plays which role then?
So I think Ireland will continue to want good relations and will have similar interests with countries, all of the countries we mention.
Mm-hmm. Free trade, I presume, yeah?
The free trade and more liberal attitude to the economy, labour markets. But I don't think Ireland wants to get locked into a Dutch sphere of influence, let's say, to put it like that.
Because that will then, but there's a debate about that in Ireland, that if you would have joined the Frugal Four, you would more or less...
There's a debate in policy circles.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
In the attentive public, but not a public debate.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So if we move now to Denmark and Ireland, to what extent would you say that that Denmark is then on Ireland's mental map? Because, I mean, obviously Denmark, we have similarities. I mean, joined at the same time, free traders, but Denmark is also very different, I mean, to Ireland if one looks upon, for instance, our 4 opt-outs. You already mentioned climate as a possibility, as a possible area where you could see more cooperation, but to what extent would you actually say that we are on each other's mental map?
So I think Irish-Danish relations have always been good. I don't think there's been big issues in the bilateral relationship. I think that for a lot of the Irish left, Denmark, but also the other Nordics, historically were always seen as the model. So if only we could be more like. So there's always been a sense of the Nordic countries as strong states and reasonably well governed. I think there are differences. So what are the differences? Irish opt-outs are not driven by domestic politics. The opt-out from Schengen is entirely driven by the common travel area between the UK and Ireland, which is absolutely necessary because of Northern Ireland. If the island of Ireland was not divided, Ireland would be a Schengen member. Oh. So Ireland does not resort to opt-outs for domestic policy reasons, other than, and here I should say that Ireland, of course, is not a member of NATO, and therefore has always said, in order to send troops under PESCO or any other, has to have the triple lock. There has to be a UN Security Council resolution. So Ireland is distinctive on security, but Ireland's distinctiveness on security comes entirely from our geographical location. Ireland really doesn't have to worry that much. It's very far over there, and if there are problems in Europe, it's good. The problems are going to start elsewhere. Now, of course, with cyber and everything, then cyber threats are not geographically bound. So I think there is a reassessment of Ireland's defence and security policy at the moment. I don't envisage Ireland joining NATO, but I do think Ireland is in PESCO and will want to be as active as possible in PESCO. So I think on the opt-outs, there is a difference. And then, of course, the other big difference is the Eurozone.
Exactly.
Ireland's well-being. Now, of course, I think also Denmark's well-being is bound up with the ability of the Eurozone to be a viable and sustainable and safe currency. Because collapse of the Eurozone isn't just a European issue, it is would be a global financial shock. So, and as we know, the Eurozone is not yet complete. Its banking union was a really important development in terms of federalization. Joint supervision was a very big development, but it's a work in progress. So that's a big difference.
Yeah.
And I think it was also interesting that Pascal Donohoe managed to become president of the Eurogroup against all of the big capitals. He got no big state votes. Spain got all the big state votes, but Ireland collected all the small state votes. And it isn't often in the EU that you get this large state, small state divide. Things tend to divide on issue, but this was a clear small state, large state vote. Ireland got 10 and Spain got 9. And the Spaniards are still wondering where that one vote that they didn't get, which country they should blame.
Well, they'll have to figure that one out themselves. That's
But Pascal Donohoe had clearly intended to launch a bid, and part of the not being with the Frugal Four was built into the calculation. And the calculation was that the Dutch will vote for us anyway because they won't want the Spaniards, but we'll get some of the smaller countries.
Okay, but that was to indicate there was a link there earlier. I mean, to you not signing up with the Frugal Four.
I have not read that there was a link.
Yeah,
but it would be my judgment.
But what about sort of one of the core topics coming up now that the European Parliament and the Commission and the Council yesterday had an agreement on the recovery fund and the budget? Now, obviously, it still has to be ratified and everything. But there's already debate now about whether the recovery fund should somehow become permanent. I mean, there's been debate about that in France, but obviously also in Germany with Olaf Scholz, the Minister of Finance, also coming out with statements like that. Would that be an area where Ireland would then side with who then? With the Frugal Four, or with the open mind, or no?
No.
No.
So I think the recovery fund is transformative in the longer term. Why do I say that? Firstly, it will be being repaid to about 2058. It's going to be around for a very long time. 2, from about 2027, it's going to have to be repaid from the EU budget. That, in my view, means that EU-level taxes are inevitable.
So the roadmap that was agreed upon yesterday.
Inevitable.
Yeah.
It won't be easy, but I don't think you can repay without extracting the repayments from the national calculations. And also, you've got to avoid that the repayments squeeze out the rest of the budget. So I'm not saying this is easy. I'm not saying how it will look like in 10 years' time, but there is an inevitable push, in my view, and it's right. And it will. I can see all the vetoes, I can see all the problems, but in my view, it's one of those pretty inexorable things that's going to happen. The third thing I would say is that the EU will discover, and is discovering, that by borrowing collectively, it creates a European safe asset. The demands for that common borrowing on the markets was dramatic. So the EU also needs to develop a capital markets union. The euro has to become a stronger international currency, and all this is win-win. So when I say, will the recovery fund become permanent? Too early to tell. But will the recovery fund generate dynamics and spillovers in a pretty classical European integration way? Yes.
Back to good old neo-functionalism or what?
There's a lot of functionalism in this box.
Yeah. Reminds me of some of our conversation we had in our earlier about integration theories. So there's going to be differences, one would have to say, between Denmark and Ireland with regards to the future sort of the recovery fund, the overall economic situation. We already touched upon climate as being in the opposite camp, so to speak, where we could have more cooperation. Do you see other areas where there could?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the digital.
Yeah.
Also, I think for both Ireland and Denmark are in relatively benign geopolitical environments. And I contrast this with the country I now live in. It really, when you move south, you do understand that places like Libya are very, very close. So I think both countries have got to think about how you stabilize what is the Danish and Irish contribution to the stabilization of the neighborhood. And it really matters. And the other, I think, thing I would say is that the EU now has two large disruptor states on its borders, Turkey and Russia. And it could be, in the event of a no deal, that it will have a third disruptor state on its border, albeit of a different kind. So I'm not equating the UK to Turkey or Russia. What I'm saying is that these are large states. And it's easy to deal with small states, much more difficult to deal with larger states. So I think that the neighborhood, the behavior of, now again, if I was optimistic, maybe the election of Biden is a wake-up call for the authoritarians that we see. But
so the Orbans of
the Orbans, Putin.
Yeah.
But again, I think on what role and contribution should small states make to European security and protection in the next phase, I think is really important.
Yeah. And talking about security, I just got a question here for you. What does it mean for Ireland that you are now a member of the UN Security Council?
So that was, I think that so Ireland has been a member of the Security Council in the past, will be again. I think it wanted to, the effort to get a Security Council seat had two drivers. One, to lift Ireland's profile globally, but also with the obsession with Brexit. And Brexit has been an obsession on the island of Ireland.
Yeah, figured that out by now, yeah.
For a long time, to also lift the diplomatic service and to give it something else to do, another goal, an important goal. And I think the Irish will work hard to be committed and helpful members of the Security Council. You know, disarmament has always been a very strong part of Irish foreign policy. So on all the areas, gender, on all of the issues that it can contribute, it will contribute. And the ambassador in the UN, Geraldine Byrne-Nason, is one of our outstanding diplomats. She's very good.
Okay. And here at the we are drawing to a close here. an advice for Denmark then, Denmark's position in the EU and various coalitions. I mean, what can we learn from the Irish case?
No, I hesitate to give advice to anyone. I think for domestic political reasons, Denmark will continue to be an opt-out country.
Oh.
But I think you should not be a frugal country. You are rich, you are prosperous. You should not think of Danish prosperity as being contained within the container of Denmark. You're a very successful nation state, perhaps too successful, because you don't understand what the world is like in less successful nation states. And I think the prosperity of Europe matters to Denmark. The success of the EU matters hugely to Denmark. If the EU disintegrated in the morning, there is no good news for any citizen in Europe. Given the kind of big power competition, US, China, etc., the world we're in. So I think Denmark has nothing to fear. And sometimes I think that there is, almost a culture of we like what we have, we protect what we have, but you can do this by also being slightly more open. I don't think Denmark has anything to fear.
And is there a price tag, would you say, by being member of the Frugal Four? I mean, compared to Ireland, that they're
yes, we're on the wrong side of history.
Wrong side of history, yeah, okay.
Yeah,
and
this was not a sensible policy for Denmark. It is in relative terms, in terms of your gross product, it was small. And don't be penny wise and pound foolish. And it's not that I would expect Denmark to throw its money around.
No.
But it really is in the interests of Europe that there is convergence and that all of Europe is prosperous. It is good for everyone, for Danish prosperity as well, but also for a sense of solidarity with neighbors. I mean, I think what probably, and this is, so I remember November 2010, when it was clear that the Troika was arriving or had arrived in Dublin, staying in the hotel right across from government buildings. The society experienced this as a trauma because here was Ireland not in charge of its destiny. Even poor Ireland, long before we joined the EU, had never had a problem with its public. It had problems with its public finances, but was never in danger of losing market access. We were losing market access in autumn 10. And that is a lesson that it can happen anyone. It can happen any country. And so I think also empathy and solidarity with neighbours matters. And I really don't want to overplay it, but I think Denmark has absolutely nothing to fear. The stronger the EU, the better for Denmark. The more secure the EU, the better for Denmark. The more prosperous the EU, the better for Denmark. So I'd lose a bit of the containing, the container.
Okay, but maybe we should end on that note. I can hear the church bells ringing here in Copenhagen. I'm sure they're also ringing in Florence. So thank you very much, Brigid, for making us a lot wiser on Brexit as such, seen from Irish perspective, but obviously also the patterns of coalition after Brexit, and also on sort of how how Ireland has basically, which conclusions you have drawn sort of from Brexit, but particularly also in the last sort of a couple of important months with the Recovery Fund. I thought that was very, very interesting, and also making sort of the comparison between our countries and also trying to pinpoint where could we have areas of more cooperation. Maybe not that surprising that you point to climate, but then one will have to figure out sort of how would we actually have that cooperation in practice? It's one thing to say that there could be an area, but how do we do it in practice, actually? I think that would be one of the tests for the future. So thank you very much. Thank you to all of our participants. There was also, I would just have to say, in the chat, there was also the fun fact, which one should never forget, about going back to the Gaelic football. There is actually a Copenhagen branch of that, and if one wants to find
there are 40 Gaelic football teams on continental Europe.
Well, there you are. So thank you very much. This was this was maybe our final sort of webinar on this topic, but we may actually have the final one where we'll look into how do the Brits actually now look upon sort of their possibilities of striking, sort of being parts of coalitions once they have sort of finalize their negotiations, whether it's then the complete no deal or whether they get a deal. We'll have to wait for that, but that could also be interesting. The ECFR is coming out with a report on that, so we may actually then just have a final session on that. But thank you very much to all our participants. Thank you very much to Brigid, and remember you can also watch this afterwards because it will be recorded and we'll put it out on our various social websites. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.